All right, let's go. Number 12. Blue Lotus. Along the banks of the Nile, more than 3,000 years ago, Egyptian warriors were consuming a flower that modern pharmacology has only recently begun to understand. The plant was Nymphaea caerulea, the blue lotus, a psychoactive water lily depicted so relentlessly across Egyptian tomb paintings that archaeologists initially assumed it was purely decorative. It was not. The Ebers papyrus, dated to approximately 1550 BCE, and among the oldest surviving medical documents in human history, describes preparations made from the blue lotus for their sedative and euphoric properties. Egyptian warriors and priests alike steeped the flowers and seeds in wine, creating a preparation that combined the alkaloids aporphine and nuciferine with the disinhibiting effects of alcohol. Egyptologist Lisa Manish, in her foundational study, An Ancient Egyptian Herbal, documented the plant's ceremonial and pharmacological significance across New Kingdom culture. What those alkaloids produced was not aggression or stimulation. The blue lotus suppressed fear. It generated a state of calm euphoria and mild sensory enhancement that pharmacologists now associate with dopamine pathway activation, creating a warrior who did not fight harder, but fought without the biological weight of self-preservation pulling against him. Tomb paintings at Thebes and Luxor, including those found in the mortuary complex of Ramesses III, show the lotus presented at ritual gatherings that preceded military campaigns. The effects were gentle by the standards of the substances that follow on this list. No hallucinations, no dissociation, no chemically induced rage, just the quiet removal of the fear of dying, which in the mathematics of ancient warfare was arguably more valuable than any of those things. The warriors who consumed it didn't fight harder. They fought without caring whether they came home. Number 11. Betel nut. For over 3,000 years, warriors across South and Southeast Asia prepared for combat by chewing a stimulant so embedded in their cultures that it appeared in sacred texts, royal courts, and battlefield accounts alike. The preparation was simple. The nut of the Areca catechu palm, wrapped in a betel leaf with a pinch of slaked lime. The effect on the armies that used it was anything but simple. Archaeological evidence for betel nut use stretches back to approximately 26 and 60 BCE, confirmed at Duyong Cave in the Philippines by researcher Robert Fox in 1970, making it one of the oldest documented psychoactive habits in human history. The Arthashastra, the ancient Indian military and political treatise attributed to the strategist Kautilya around 300 BCE, references betel as a substance distributed to fighting men, and the Mahabharata places it at the center of warrior culture across the Indian subcontinent. The active compound is auricoline, a nicotinic acetylcholine agonist that behaves similarly to nicotine, but with greater intensity. Heart rate increases. Alertness sharpens. Hunger and fatigue recede. For soldiers facing days of marching before a battle, then hours of combat without food or rest, these effects were not recreational. They were operational. The World Health Organization now classifies auricoline as a Group 1 carcinogen, and approximately 600 million people still use the preparation today, making it the most widely consumed psychoactive substance on Earth after caffeine and nicotine. There was one additional effect that no field manual could have planned for. The lime in the preparation reacts with betel to produce a vivid red saliva. Armies of men advancing with crimson-stained mouths and teeth created the visual impression of soldiers already tasting blood. When your enemy's smile looks like a wound, how do you hold your ground? Number 10. Khat leaves. In the highlands of Ethiopia and the mountains of Yemen, warriors chewed fresh green leaves before battle that gave them something modern militaries have spent billions of dollars trying to replicate in a laboratory: the ability to march for days without sleep, fight without food, and advance without fear. The plant was Khatha edulis. The leaves were Khat, and they have been fueling soldiers in the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula for at least 1,000 years. Arabic historian al-Makrizi, writing in the 15th century, documented Khat's spread through Ethiopian and Yemeni cultures as a stimulant consumed before periods of intense physical or spiritual exertion. By the era of the Ethiopian-Egyptian War, Ethiopian soldiers of the 1870s were reported by observers to use Khat regularly on campaign, sustaining the energy and aggression needed for engagements fought across brutal highland terrain at altitude. The active compound, cathinone, is a naturally occurring amphetamine analog, meaning the chemical mechanism by which it works is nearly identical to the synthetic drugs that 20th century militaries would later issue to their own soldiers. Cathinone produces intense euphoria, suppresses hunger and fatigue, elevates heart rate, and increases aggression for 3 to 4 hours before collapsing into a prolonged depressive crash. The UN Convention on Psychotropic Substances placed cathinone under international control in 1971. What distinguishes Khat from almost every other primal combat drug is one extraordinary fact. It degrades rapidly after harvest and must be consumed within 48 hours of picking. This biological clock limited its spread for centuries, confining it to the regions where it grew. Journalists covering conflicts in Yemen and Somalia in the 21st century documented soldiers chewing khat in active combat zones. The same leaves, the same chemical, the same function across 10 centuries of unbroken warfare. The same leaves chewed before raids in the ancient highlands of Aksum were still being tucked into soldiers' cheeks in the Yemeni civil war. Number 9. Ephedra. Thousands of years before chemists synthesized amphetamines in a laboratory, ancient warriors across Central Asia were already consuming a plant that worked by almost identical mechanisms. The plant was Ephedra sinica, a woody shrub that grows across the high steppes and mountain passes of Iran, Afghanistan, and western China, and the evidence that warriors used it before battle is not textual. It is buried in the ground beside them. In the early 1990s, Soviet archaeologist Viktor Saryanidi excavated the Bronze Age ritual complex at Gonur Tepe in modern Turkmenistan, dated to approximately 2100 to 1800 BCE, and found ceramic vessels containing ephedra residue alongside ritual drinking implements. The site belongs to the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, a civilization contemporary with ancient Egypt and early Mesopotamia. Ethnobotanist David Stofflet Flattery and classicist Martin Schwartz, in their 1989 scholarly study Hyoma and Harmaline, argued that ephedra was the primary botanical source of Hyoma, the sacred ritual drink of Zoroastrian warriors and priests, and likely of Soma, its Vedic Indian equivalent, consumed in ceremonies that explicitly preceded battle. The active compounds, ephedrine and pseudoephedrine, are sympathomimetic amines. They dilate the bronchial tubes, accelerate the heart, elevate blood pressure, and sharpen alertness by triggering the same adrenal pathways that activate during genuine physical threat. The body is essentially tricked into a sustained fight-or-flight state before the fighting begins. Japanese chemist Nagai Nagayoshi isolated ephedrine in pure form in 1885. It became the direct chemical precursor to the synthesis of methamphetamine. How different is the Parthian cavalry soldier chewing ephedra stems before a charge from the modern soldier handed a prescription amphetamine before a combat mission? Number 8. Mandrake root. In the ancient Mediterranean world, there was a plant so toxic that the wrong dose meant death, so powerful that battlefield surgeons used it as the world's first documented general anesthetic, and so psychologically devastating that those who consumed it reported complete separation from their own bodies. It was Mandragora officinarum, the mandrake, and its most famous military deployment was not used to empower warriors. It was used to destroy them. Greek military writer Polyaenus, compiling his Stratagems of War in the 2nd century CE, recorded an account from the Carthaginian campaigns in North Africa, in which a Carthaginian commander, facing a rebellion among mercenary Libyan troops, ordered wine laced with mandrake preparations to be left in the enemy camp before a tactical withdrawal. The Libyan soldiers, finding what appeared to be an abandoned supply, consumed it freely. The Carthaginians returned to find them incapacitated, insensible, and entirely unable to resist. They were slaughtered to a man. The pharmacological basis for this is precise and documented. Mandrake contains hyoscine, also known as scopolamine, along with hyoscyamine and atropine, all of them potent anticholinergic alkaloids. Greek physician Dioscorides described mandrake's properties in detail in De Materia Medica around 65 CE, noting that a wine preparation would induce deep, pain-free sleep lasting several hours. The Old Testament references mandrake in Genesis and the Song of Solomon as a plant of overwhelming power. The therapeutic window between a sedating dose and a lethal one is extraordinarily narrow, a margin measured not in multiples, but in milligrams. The Carthaginians didn't need swords to defeat their enemies that night. They just needed wine, mandrake, and patience. Number 7. Henbane. In burial sites across Iron Age Europe, archaeologists keep finding the same thing alongside the remains of shamans and warriors. Small caches of dark, kidney-shaped seeds from a plant so dangerous that a handful of them, consumed incorrectly, produced raving madness followed by death. The plant was Hyoscyamus niger, black henbane, and the evidence of its use in ritual combat. Preparation is not theoretical. It is sitting in museum cases in England and Germany, excavated from graves that are over 4,000 years old. Seeds of henbane were recovered from the burial of the Upton Lovell shaman in Wiltshire, England, dated to approximately 2300 BCE, found alongside amber beads, bone points, and goldwork in a deliberate ritual assemblage. Archaeobotanist Marieke van der Veen of the University of Leicester and the late scholar Andrew Sherritt documented henbane's recurring presence at Iron Age warrior and ritual sites across Central Europe, placing it firmly within the ceremonial pharmacopoeia of pre-Roman Celtic cultures. Julius Caesar, writing in his Gallic Wars between 58 and 49 BCE, described Celtic warriors advancing through wounds that would have stopped any Roman soldier, continuing to fight through injuries that should have been incapacitating. The pharmacological explanation for what Caesar witnessed is now well understood. Henbane contains hyoscyamine, scopolamine, and atropine in concentrations that, at the correct dose, chemically prevent the brain from registering pain or fear. This is not suppression of the sensation. It is blockade of the neural pathways that generate it. The warrior does not feel brave. He simply cannot feel afraid, because the biological infrastructure of fear has been temporarily dismantled. The estimated lethal dose is approximately 50 to 100 seeds, barely a handful, making dosing a genuinely lethal art. When Caesar described Celtic warriors fighting through wounds that would stop any normal man, was he witnessing bravery, or was he watching men whose brains had been chemically stripped of the ability to feel afraid? Number 6. Coca leaves. High in the Andes Mountains, the armies of the Inca Empire conquered a territory stretching over 4,000 miles along the spine of South America, fighting wars at altitudes above 3,500 meters, where the air itself becomes an enemy. They did it fueled by a leaf that their state controlled as carefully as any modern military controls its weapon stockpiles. The leaf was Coca, Erythroxylum coca, and the Inca didn't just permit its use by soldiers. They made it state policy. The Inca state, Tawantinsuyu, which reached its height between 1438 and 1533 CE, maintained an absolute monopoly over coca cultivation and distribution. Access was restricted to warriors, priests, and nobility. Spanish chronicler Pedro de Cieza de Leon, who witnessed the aftermath of the Inca Empire in his Chronicle of Peru in 1553, observed that Inca soldiers marched for days without food by chewing coca leaves mixed with llama ash, an alkaline catalyst that activates the cocaine alkaloids in the leaf. Archaeological evidence for coca use in the Andes from excavations at the site of Huaca Prieta in coastal Peru led by archaeologist Tom Dillahay of Vanderbilt University, extends as far back as approximately 8000 BCE. The pharmacological effects were precisely suited to Andean warfare. Coca suppresses hunger, thirst, and fatigue. Critically, it suppresses altitude sickness, the debilitating condition that strikes lowland-adapted bodies above 3,000 meters, producing headaches, weakness, and impaired decision-making. A warrior who did not feel the altitude fought at full capacity in conditions that would incapacitate an unmedicated opponent from the lowlands. The Inca warrior chewed coca to conquer mountains. His grandson chewed it in a Spanish silver mine. The leaf was the same. Everything else had changed. Number 5. Fly agaric. For over a century, historians and Norse scholars argued about whether the berserkers, the most feared warriors in Viking history, were a myth, a metaphor, or a pharmacological reality. The Norse sagas described them entering a state called berserksgangur, a battle rage so total that they felt no pain, broke through shield walls with their bare hands, and had to be restrained by their own comrades before combat began, lest they attack everyone around them. The debate about what produced this state has a leading candidate, and it is the bright red mushroom with white spots that appears in every fairy tale your children have ever read. Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic historian who compiled the Ynglinga saga around 1225 CE, described berserkers as men who were mad as dogs or wolves, who bit their shields and were as strong as bears, and who were immune to fire and iron during the frenzy. The hypothesis that Amanita muscaria, fly agaric mushroom, was the pharmacological engine behind berserksgangur was first proposed formally by Swedish physician Samuel Udman in 1784. It was later supported by ethnomycologist R. Gordon Wasson and developed most rigorously by Neil Price, professor of archaeology at Uppsala University, in his 2002 study, The Viking Way. The active compounds, muscimol and ibotenic acid, are GABA-A receptor agonists that produce effects entirely distinct from other hallucinogens: intense euphoria, dissociation, a perceived amplification of physical size and strength, and critically, complete insensitivity to pain. One documented secondary practice from Siberian shamanic cultures, recorded by 18th century explorer Johann Georg Gmelin, adds a genuinely extraordinary detail. The urine of a fly agaric consumer retains active muscimol and was consumed by others to achieve a secondary intoxication. The berserkers were eventually outlawed not because they lost battles. Around 1015 CE, Iceland's Althing, the world's oldest parliament, banned them by law because there was no off-switch. Men who had learned to consume their way into a killing frenzy could not be reliably turned back into farmers and fathers when the war was over. Number 4. Cannabis. In the 5th century BCE, the Greek historian Herodotus described a warrior people from the Eurasian steppe, who, after battle, crawled into small felt tents, threw seeds onto burning coals, and screamed with pleasure at the vapor that surrounded them. He was precise about what he saw. He named the plant. He described the ritual in the kind of specific, almost anthropological detail that characterizes his most reliable reporting. For 2,000 years, scholars debated whether he was exaggerating. Then, in 2019, archaeologists dug up the proof. A team led by German researcher Anton Gass excavated a Scythian burial mound, or kurgan, in the Caucasus region and recovered golden ritual vessels dated to approximately 400 BCE. Chemical analysis confirmed the residue inside was cannabis and opium. The vessels matched Herodotus's description of the hemp seed ceremony with a precision that was, by any measure, remarkable. The relevant passage from Herodotus, Book 4 of his Histories, written around 440 BCE, reads, "The Scythians take some of this hemp seed, and creeping under the felt coverings, throw it upon the red-hot stones. Immediately it smokes, and gives out such a vapor as no Grecian vapor bath can exceed." In a separate 2019 study published in Science Advances, archaeologist Yimin Yang analyzed cannabis residue from the Jirzankal cemetery in western China, dated to approximately 500 BCE, and found elevated THC concentrations consistent with psychoactive strains, indicating deliberate cultivation for intoxicant properties rather than fiber. The Scythians were among the most feared cavalry forces in the ancient world. They defeated the Persian king Darius I in 513 BCE, a campaign documented by Herodotus himself, by refusing pitched battle and instead drawing the Persian army deeper into the steppe until it collapsed from exhaustion and supply failure. Cannabis was not their battle drug in the stimulant sense. It was their recovery ritual, their decompression chamber, the pharmacological mechanism by which men who lived and died on horseback processed the violence they carried home. For 2,000 years, we assumed Herodotus was embellishing. Then we found the vessels, and the residue was still inside them. Number 3. Datura. Of every plant on this list, only one was described by those who administered it as requiring a keeper, a dedicated human attendant whose sole responsibility was to prevent the warrior who had consumed it from killing his own allies. The plant was Datura. The attendant was not a precaution. He was a medical necessity. Datura stramonium and Datura metal contain the most potent naturally occurring combination of anticholinergic alkaloids known to pharmacology: atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamine, all three simultaneously present in concentrations that make the therapeutic and lethal doses nearly indistinguishable. The Florentine Codex, the encyclopedic record of Aztec culture compiled by Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún between 1540 and 1577, documents Datura, known as Toloash, within ceremonial contexts preceding warfare. The Arthashastra, the Indian military treatise attributed to Kautilya around 300 BCE, references Datura preparations as a weapon to be introduced into enemy food and water supplies, marking it as both a warrior drug and a weapon of war within the same civilization, used in opposite directions depending on the strategic situation. What Datura produces is not euphoria, not fearlessness, not enhanced strength. It produces ambulatory psychosis. The person who consumes a combat-level dose is physically active, moving, capable of violence, but experiencing full visual and auditory hallucinations with complete amnesia of everything they do. There is no dose that produces a predictable, controlled effect. The gap between a psychoactive dose and a fatal one is measured in milligrams. A 1676 account recorded by colonial Virginia historian Robert Beverly in his History and Present State of Virginia in 1705 describes British soldiers who accidentally consumed Datura near Jamestown and remained in a state of complete delirium for 11 consecutive days, grinning, talking nonsense, and unable to recognize each other. The plant's common name, Jimson weed, is a corruption of Jamestown weed. The incident entered American history as a cautionary tale. In the cultures that weaponized Datura deliberately, it was not a cautionary tale. It was a tactical doctrine. What does it mean to send a man into battle in a state of complete psychosis? And is the warrior who emerges from that experience still the same person who went in? Number 2. Opium. 3,500 years before the first morphine syringe was filled in a field hospital, Sumerian scribes were pressing cuneiform symbols into clay tablets to record the properties of a plant they called Hulgil, the joy plant. The tablets, excavated from the ancient city of Nippur in modern Iraq and dated to approximately 3400 BCE, represent the oldest written reference to any psychoactive substance in human history. From that first recorded moment to the present day, opium has never left the battlefield. The Ebers Papyrus, the Egyptian medical text dated to approximately 1550 BCE, describes opium preparations for pain suppression used by military surgeons accompanying Egyptian campaigns into Nubia and the Levant. The raw latex of Papaver somniferum contains morphine at concentrations of 10 to 12% by dry weight, along with codeine, thebane, and over 50 additional alkaloids, giving it a pharmacological profile that no synthetic drug has yet equaled for managing both the fear before violence and the pain after it. Greek physician Dioscorides documented military medical applications across the Mediterranean world in his De Materia Medica around 65 CE. Arab traders carried opium to India and China between the 7th and 9th centuries CE. Court historian Abul Fazl ibn Mubarak, chronicling the campaigns of the Mughal Emperor Akbar in the Akbarnama, noted opium's role in managing the demands placed on soldiers during prolonged military operations across the subcontinent. Opium is the only substance on this list that served simultaneously as a pre-battle courage preparation, a battlefield surgical anesthetic, a post-battle trauma treatment, and an imperial trade commodity fought over with armies of its own. The First Opium War of 1839 to 1842, in which Britain went to war with China to protect its right to sell the drug to the Chinese population, is the direct linear descendant of those first Sumerian tablets pressed in the city of Nippur. Every pharmaceutical opioid prescribed in a military hospital today, every veteran's dependency, every post-war addiction crisis traces a direct chemical line back to the Sumerian soldier, reaching for his clay jar of joy plant before marching into the desert. But for the single most strategically devastating use of a psychoactive substance in the history of warfare, opium is not the answer. The answer is older than any army, and more calculated than any battle plan. Number 1. Hashish, the Assassins. In 1090 CE, a Persian scholar and religious leader named Hassan Isabah seized the mountain fortress of Alamut in the Alborz range of modern Iran and founded something that had never existed before, a state whose primary military instrument was not an army, but individuals. Single, trained, self-sacrificing operatives dispatched across the medieval Islamic world to kill the most heavily guarded men alive, sultans and viziers and crusader kings, in broad daylight, in throne rooms and mosques, accepting their own deaths as the operational conclusion of the mission. For nearly 2 centuries, the Nizari Ismaili state at Alamut held the medieval world in a terror that no conventional army could produce. Marco Polo visited the region around 1273 CE and returned with an account that, when it circulated through Europe, became the most debated origin story in the history of organized violence. Polo described in Il Milione, compiled around 1300 CE, how Hassani Saba recruited young men by drugging them, placing them in a garden of extraordinary beauty surrounded by women, food, and music, and allowing them to believe they had entered paradise. When they were brought back, they were told that only the successful completion of their assigned killing would return them to that garden permanently. Crusader chronicler William of Tyre, writing in the 1170s CE, recorded that these warriors were known among their enemies as Hashashin, users of hashish, and it is from this word, passing through medieval French and Latin, that the English language acquired the word assassin. The historian Farhad Daftari, in his 1994 study, The Assassin Legends, disputes the literal hashish connection and argues the name's etymology is more complex, but confirms its documented use by contemporary enemies of the Nizari state. What is not disputed is the operational record. The Fedayeen of Alamut killed Nizam al-Mulk, the most powerful political figure in the Seljuk Empire, in 1092 CE. They killed Conrad of Montferrat, king of Jerusalem, in 1192 CE. They attempted to kill Saladin himself twice, in 1174 and 1176 CE, reaching him both times through what should have been impenetrable security. Hashish, the concentrated resin of Cannabis sativa, contains THC concentrations of 20 to 60%, many times the potency of leaf cannabis. At high doses, the pharmacological effects include full visual hallucination, radical distortion of time, ego dissolution, and an overwhelming sense of transcendent significance. Precisely the experiential raw material from which a medieval theologian could construct a convincing preview of paradise. Whether the garden was literal, chemical, or metaphorical, the operational result was the same. Men who could not be bribed, threatened, or turned back, who walked into fortified palaces and died completing their instructions, generation after generation, for nearly 200 years. Alamut was destroyed by the Mongol general Hulagu Khan in 1256 CE, its library burned, its community scattered. The scholar Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, who had been at Alamut, defected to the Mongols and went on to become one of the greatest astronomers of the medieval world, taking the assassin's internal records with him into an archive that has never been fully recovered. The true pharmacological and ritual details of what happened inside those walls remain, deliberately or accidentally, lost. What was not lost was the word. Every language on earth now contains it, a primal, ritualistic reminder that somewhere in the mountains of Persia, a man with a garden and a drug, and a theological promise built the most feared fighting force of the medieval world, not from armies, not from fortresses, but from the absolute certainty that what waited on the other side of death was worth more than anything that stood between a young man and his target. Hassani Saba didn't need an army. He needed a drug, a garden, and men who no longer feared death. For nearly 200 years, that was enough to hold the medieval world in terror, and the word his enemies invented to describe those men has outlasted every empire, every fortress, and every certainty of that age. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.